Hey, what is up, everybody? This is JP representing jpfitnesspro.com. First things first, like I said in my last YouTube video and like I've been posting about, my website is complete. It was complete before, which might be a little misleading, but I mean complete as in I changed the way it looked. I uploaded my first training program. I uploaded an option for a custom program. I have options for online training if you guys want that. So please go and check that out. It's all at jpfitnesspro.com. You can see everything there. You can message me if you want. You can subscribe to my newsletter so you get all that good stuff. But today's podcast is going to be specifically about progression. And what I mean is, it is probably one of the most overlooked and ignored parts of a training program that I see today. There are many things that consist of a good training program. A lot of people write down their own program, which is why I feel like I should talk about this. And here soon, I'm going to go over my periodization part 2 and 3. I already have a podcast that goes over periodization part 1. But I just feel as if progression is just completely ignored. Again, there are a lot of things that make up a good program. For example, some of them being like one key component is exercise selection. You know, if you want to get stronger, you got to pick the right exercises. Another component is rep range. You know, if you want to get stronger but you never go heavy, or you go too heavy too often, that can mess you up too. So you have like exercise selection, picking the right exercises, rep ranges, rest periods, which may not be as important, but they're still important. You know, if you have too short of rest periods in your strength training, you might be cutting yourself short of gains, and then you increase your chance for injuries. You know, if you're doing heavy squats and heavy squats at a high RPE and you're only giving yourself a minute rest or 30 seconds rest because you've seen something about hypertrophy training, and then you kind of you're combining the two in a weird way and not the best way. You are increasing your injury risk. I mean, it's just a fact. Doing heavy compound movements when you're fatigued and tired from the previous set versus when you have a good rest period, you're going to increase your chance for injury risk. So again, there are lots of components to that. And when I see people working out, a lot of people get a lot of things right. They pick the right exercises, which is good. They pick exercises that are going to get them stronger. Typically, rep ranges aren't a huge thing that people get wrong. Frequency is another one that I would say that people get it right in some circumstances. So some people are kind of still doing those old school bro splits where they do one muscle group per week. Which again, I did a video on training splits, and I guess I don't want to say shit on bro splits, but I didn't give it a good light. And again, if it is what keeps you going to the gym, then fine, keep doing it. But some people stick to bro splits where they only hit a muscle group once a week, but typically I feel like that's getting a little bit better. The fitness community as a whole, is even people who aren't trainers themselves or who don't follow training. Typically, I see them doing more higher frequency work. They work out muscle groups more than one time a week, which is good. And I'm talking about my interactions with people. That's what this whole thing is about, because this isn't a hard science that I'm talking about. I mean, progression is, but I'm just talking about like what people do is. I constantly run into people that they don't have a training program, and this kind of all goes back to the one episode of the Exercise Science podcast that I did about. It was basically about personal anecdotes. It was, I think I titled the podcast was, but it works for me, and I don't want to say anecdote because I'm not trying to be rude, and a lot of people don't know what that term means and won't relate. But when people see that phrase, but it works for me, they instantly it clicks, especially if you're in the fitness community. People say that all the time, which it's a bad reason to do something or to tell other people to do stuff. I mean, when people say, oh, it works for me, they really don't know if that's the best route to take and it works for them. They really don't. Because they haven't tried the optimal way. I mean, if you're smart about it, you try the optimal way to do something, and then you try something else, and you unbiasedly look at it and say, okay, well, this way works better for me, and I've tried the optimal way, and I gave the optimal way a good chance, so tweaking it works better. A lot of people don't try the optimal way, the way that science has said is correct. They'll jump straight to some weird, odd way of doing something, and they'll say, oh, but it works for me. Well, how do you not know something won't work better? But what I'm saying is that this kind of ties into that, is because with progression, when I talk to people and and again, I never play gym police. I don't walk around and say, oh, what are you doing? I don't like doing that. This is for me generally talking to people, or people asking me questions, they don't have a form of progression put into place. When they come into the gym, they know what exercises they're doing, they know what rep ranges they're doing, but how does that tie into next week, and how does that tie into the larger scheme of things? Do you have a planned, like, a whole, this is almost like progression and periodization. They don't understand how they're going to progress from week to week. They just know what they're going to do that day. And then, it just, things are so random, like, for example, what I see a lot is people come to the gym, they'll pick an exercise, or they'll have exercises laid out on their head. They'll have rep ranges laid out on their head, and then they just kind of go through the gym saying, oh, I guess I'll do sumo deadlifts today. I've actually heard people say that. They say, oh, I guess I'll just do sumo today. Like, they didn't know what they were going to do. And then, they may say, oh yeah, I took last weekend off, this week I feel like I'm going to do this. It's all about feeling. And yes, while this can get you some gains at the very beginning, you're going to plateau very quickly. You are. I mean, it's a fact. You're going to plateau very quickly because you can only, have this kind of inconsistent off and on routine for a while to make gains. And then eventually you just, you may have an off day that day, or that day may have been, you may have been training too heavy, too much recently, and you may have a day where you test yourself or whatever, and then you're like, why didn't I hit a PR? Why didn't I break a personal record of mine? But you didn't really think about it. Maybe you just did too many heavy days and you didn't take a deload, and certain qualities like that. So I guess it's just from me talking to people, and I feel like progression is just wrong. So now I'm going to talk about some key things that you should think about when it comes to progression and why it's overlooked and why it's important. So let's start with a beginner, someone who's a beginner. The main point you need to understand for beginner lifters is that they can progress fast. Someone who hasn't worked out in a long time and has just started back again. Let's just say you're someone who hasn't worked out in a couple months, 3-4 months, or even a year or two, you just haven't worked out for a while, but you've worked out before. Or you're someone who has never worked out in your life, you've never really done the gym thing, and you're just starting out. Those are someone I would consider a beginner. So I guess someone who hasn't worked out in 3 months or longer, I would consider a beginner. Once you're 3 months out from working out, I would say you're sufficiently detrained. Anything under 3 months, you probably still have some remnant of that. But if you haven't worked out in 3 months and you're a natural lifter, I would say that you're pretty much a beginner. You could start on a beginner program and make gains. Maybe if you're someone who has been training for a very long time, like if you've been training like for longer than 10 years and you take 3 months off, you might still not be considered a beginner. If you try to do a beginner program, you might not really make progress. But again, that's kind of like an outlier. Most people haven't been training very hard consistently for 10 years. And then stop for 3 months. Now, if you're that case, maybe you need to be a little bit longer. If I have to give a safe bet, I guess I'd say maybe 6 months. If you haven't touched the gym in 6 months, then I would consider you a beginner. But if you're someone who you haven't touched the gym in 3 months and you haven't worked out a lot in general in your life, 3 months, I would say you're sufficiently detrained. Now, if you fall into this category and you're a beginner, again, the main thing to realize is that you can progress fast. Every week, the exercises you have, depending on the exercise, you can probably just add weight to the bar and keep the reps the same, and you'll still be able to do those reps, that rep range. So let's just take a squat, for example. If you're doing squat on week 1, and then week 2 you're doing squat again, you could probably add 5 pounds to each side, which is 10 pounds total to the bar, and you could probably keep up that rep range. If that's too much for you, you could probably even just do 2.5 pounds on each side, which is 5 pounds total. But regardless, you're going to be able to add some form of weight to the bar every week to heavy compound movements. Now, certain movements, just due to the torque that's involved, the moment arm, and just the type of movement, if it's a multi-joint movement or not, you're not going to, even as a beginner, you're not going to be able to add load every week. Let's take an example like the lateral raise. If you take a lateral raise, you're not going to, even as a beginner, you're not going to be able to add load every week. But as a beginner, you may be able to add a load once a month to a lateral raise, versus a squat where it's a very heavy compound movement that requires a lot of muscle groups that are going to be working and goes through a lot of joints. You know, so a squat's a multi-joint movement versus a lateral raise where it's a single joint movement. So like single joint movements and smaller muscle group movements, you're probably going to be able to go up maybe once a month. But again, that's the rate of progression for a beginner, you know. So I would say heavy compound movements, you could go up week to week. Smaller, you know, single joint movements, you could probably go up once a month. And then there's muscle groups that are kind of, or exercises that are in between those two. Like let's take another example would be like the overhead press. The overhead press is a compound movement, but it doesn't recruit as much muscle as, like, let's say a squat or deadlift. So an overhead press is something that you could probably do every other week, so twice a month. You know, you can add weight to it, and then you'll be able to stay within like that rep range without, you know, dropping from that rep range. Someone who is not a beginner, which I'll go over into a little bit, I'm just going to touch up on right now to give a comparison, is let's just say you take a beginner and you take a not a beginner. And let's just say the squat, like the example I used a little bit ago. If they both try to add weight from week to week, the non-beginner or the intermediate or advanced athlete is not going to be able to stay in that rep range. It could be any rep range. It will stay 9 to 12. They are not going to be able to stay in that 9 to 12 rep range if they increase their load week to week. Eventually, in a week or two, or even that very next week, the weight's going to be too heavy and they're going to fall below that rep range, or the RPE is going to be too high. They're going to have to train to failure every set just to get into that 9 to 12 rep range, or they're going to have to do something else weird like take really, really long rest periods to stay in that 9 to 12 rep range, which, you know, good sufficient rest periods are okay, but really, really long rest periods may be a bit ridiculous for, you know, it may make your workout like a ridiculously long time. So versus a beginner, though, they're going to be able to increase week to week or every 2 weeks for those kind of multi-joints, you know, smaller muscle group movements, or for once a month for those single joint movements. You know, now what happens is if you take a beginner and then they do that, they follow a simple program, or they're just, because again, beginners can keep things simple. They can progress with simple periodization and progression schemes. They don't need to make it complicated. The reason why this is because you get heavy returns for doing something. So if you're a beginner, you have a lot of untapped potential for certain exercises. Your nervous system hasn't really, for someone who doesn't work out and starts to work out, your nervous system is getting all this kind of like return on how to go through this movement. Basically, it's going to learn these motor patterns for these specific movements and get better at them. Your body's going to learn how to recruit muscle fibers all at the same time, because again, your body gets better at doing that. There is a good analogy that my certification actually put in their book. And again, I don't always go back to my certification, since I think a lot of certifications can get things wrong and they're biased. But one thing I do remember from my book, which I do like, is think of your muscle fibers like a rowboat. Like, think of a boat, you know, like a rowboat, you have 3 people on each side, or you can think 10 people on each side. When you first start working out, your muscle fibers fire like an unorganized rowboat, you know. If you had a rowboat and everyone's rowing at different times, no one's rowing hard, and you guys are rowing real slow, then you're not going, and let's just say all the people on the rowboat are pretty weak, none of them are jacked. Your boat's not going to go that fast, you know. But you start doing things is when you start teaching the rowboat how to row better, you know, and row more often, which is basically the equivalent of exercising more often or starting to exercise. The people start rowing in unison. If they start rowing in unison, your boat's gonna go faster. It's not gonna start going left and right. It's gonna be able to go in a straight line, which is gonna make you go faster. Also, if they row more often, they're gonna get stronger, which means that they're just gonna go faster from rowing harder. And then they're also, so they're gonna row harder, and then they're also going to be able to row faster. So on top of rowing harder, rowing faster, and all rowing at the same time, eventually their boat is going to be able to go much faster than it was at the beginning. Muscle fibers kind of function in that same way, is that when you do a movement for the first time, your nervous system says, okay, this is the motor pattern that we need to be able to learn and do to make this movement more efficient. So like in a squat, your leg muscle fibers start to learn how to work together in unison for like heavy compound movements. For lighter movements, different things happen where muscle fibers will alternate firing to be able to kind of sustain those contractions. So they don't all fire in unison if it's higher repetitions, just due to efficiency. But again, think of your muscle fibers like a rowboat. They start to get bigger, which means they can produce more force. They start to all contract at the same time, which helps them produce one unison force when you're working with heavier weight. and then they start to fire faster. So that's what happens when you're beginners. You're getting all this kind of like untapped potential, and you're getting it really fast. Strength adaptations happen quicker as a beginner than hypertrophy adaptations do. So you get stronger faster than you gain muscle at the beginning. Eventually, though, once you learn that technique and that motor pattern, that kind of like you tap that out faster than you do hypertrophy, and most of your strength gains down the line come from gaining more muscle, packing more muscle onto your frame, and a little bit comes from getting better, at your squat, because you can always probably correct some form of your squat and your exercises and stuff like that. So that's basically what happens as a beginner. You have a lot of untapped potential, which is why you can increase like in a fast manner in that way. Now, once you do this and you keep working out this way, eventually there's going to come a time where you cannot increase load anymore. You're kind of you start getting diminishing returns on that that nervous system adaptation and that skill acquisition for those exercises. So your body kind of starts to get most of the returns it's going to get from learning that motor pattern, and you get most of the returns you get from learning that skill, doing the right setup, just having correct technique for most of your work. And remember, it takes forever to master these exercises, but you can get most of the fundamentals down fairly early on if you're, you're intelligent enough to catch on that way. You don't need to be super smart. Just as long as you put in the work and pay attention, then yeah, you should get most of the fundamentals down pretty early on in your training career. So eventually you start to slow down with those you're not able to add weight week to week. You just can't do it, because if you do, it becomes too heavy. You start falling below the rep range. And then you just can't do that no more. So then what do you do from there? Someone may say, okay, well, I can't add weight anymore. What do I do? Do I just keep doing the same weight now? Well, no. If you kept doing the same weight, then you wouldn't go anywhere. You have to have slower forms of progression, which means you kind of have to add weight in a slower way. And like I said earlier, is once you kind of get that most of that nervous system adaptation and that skill acquisition down, your the best way at that point, again, this is very individual dependent. Some people may have like huge holes in their form and technique for a long time and may not notice it, and they correct something and then boom, they gain a lot of strength from doing that. But I'm saying in a normal individual who progresses at a normal rate, most of their strength gains are going to come from hypertrophy later on down the line. So you need to have slower ways to increase load and progress than you did when you were a beginner. One form of this would be like, it's called linear periodization, because the first way I told you for a beginner was linear progression, then it goes linear periodization. So what you do is you kind of, you add a weight to your exercises, but within longer gaps between that. So for week 1, you could have a 9 to 12 rep range. Then for week 2, you go heavier, but you lower the rep range versus keeping it the same. So you can increase weight and lower the rep range. That's perfectly fine. Anybody can do that. Then for week 3, you may do the same thing, increase the weight again, and at the same time lower the rep range even more. So you could go week 1 9 to 12 at a reasonable RPE, like a 5 to 7 RPE. Then week 2, you could go a 6 to 8 at a 6 to 8 rep range at a 6 to 8 RPE. And then week 3, you could go 4 to 6 reps at 8 to 9 RPE, So you're getting closer to failure, the weight's getting heavier, but the volume is decreasing over weeks 1 to 3. Week 4, you take a deload week, and then week 5, that's when you increase load on the 9 to 12 rep range lift just by a little bit. So instead of adding weight week to week, you're now adding weight every 5 weeks. So it's a slower rate of progression, but at the same time, you're kind of doing multiple things when you do it this way. One, you're getting stronger, because remember, with strength, specificity is king. So if you want to get stronger, you have to train in heavier rep ranges. This has been proven by far over and over. This is pretty black and white, straightforward. This is not a gray area. So you need to train in the heavier rep ranges, the lower rep ranges, if you want to optimize strength gains. So versus the original beginner way, where we kind of stuck to that 9 to 12 and didn't change the rep ranges, which again, there are multiple ways to make a program. Once you apply the science, I forgot where I read this quote, to whoever said it. It's a good quote, but it said once you apply the science, making a program is more of an art. You know, you have to apply the science first. You have to look at the science, but once you get past that, it's more of an art. So there are multiple ways to make a program. I can make a beginner program with different rep ranges. I'm just giving you guys examples to make this a bit simpler. But where you, in this example, where you kept the beginner rep ranges the same, and the intermediate rep ranges, they're alternating. They change. You know, as you get heavier, the rep range is lower because again, you're not able to keep the rep ranges the same and increase load. You just did that, and you can't do that anymore. So you lower the rep ranges, which means you're actually training heavier for yourself. So you're going heavier for yourself, which means you're getting stronger. So you're basically using this newfound muscle that you're getting in like weeks 1 to 2, you know, to help with like your strength in week 3. You're taking a deload to minimize fatigue so that when you come back fresh for week 1, you're able to increase the load again. So the week 1 of that second 4-week cycle would be the 5th week. So you have 1, 2, 3, increasing load, decreasing rep ranges, week 4 deload, and then week 5, boom, rinse and repeat. So again, so that would be, you know, increasing load and progressing at a slower rate, but because you are now an intermediate lifter. Now, same thing with like beginner lifters. If you do this for a while and you find that you can't progress, you know, eventually you're going to sit there and plateau. You're going to say, well, okay, now I get to this 5th week, I can't increase load anymore. You know, now you're really getting heavy diminishing returns. So to give an example, remember this is just an example, you could do this many ways of what an advanced athlete might do. Just like I said at the beginning, again, just to kind of reiterate, is that once you tap out, you know, nervous system adaptation and skill acquisition when it comes to strength, the last thing that's going to help you is, you know, being able to progress more, getting stronger, is increasing muscle mass. And the best way to increase muscle mass is to find rep ranges that help you accumulate the most volume with the proper stimulus. And I think the proper, what the science says, and from my opinion on it, is that the proper stimulus is training relatively close to failure with weights. You don't have to train to failure, and there are times where you could train to failure, but training just relatively close to failure is good enough. So, and that rep range to me, and what I've seen, is the 7 to 15 rep range. And if you train within that rep range, 7 to 15, it could be a 9 to 12, it could be a 6 to 8, it could be a 12 to 15, but somewhere in the 7 to 15 rep range, that's the best way, in my opinion, to accumulate volume if you're training relatively close to failure, to help gain muscle. So for an advanced training, what you might have is it's called block periodization, but you might have a block that's just focused on, you're not increasing weight on anything, but you're just adding sets week to week. You're adding sets week to week, which is going to help, which means you're increasing volume with that proper stimulus of training relatively close to failure. Because again, science has shown that when if you're too far from failure, you're not going to be able to make optimal gains or any gains at all. You know, you can't be too far from failure. Now, some people say you have to train to failure, which I also disagree with. You don't need to train to failure. Again, science has said that if any of you guys want me to cite these sources, you know, let me know and I'll send them to you. You know, but I just feel like it's easy to look up, and it's for now, if you're following the science, I don't want to say it's common sense. It's not, but I mean, it's what I'm trying to say is, because I'm not trying to disrespect anybody, but it's easy to look up. You could look up this stuff, and it's not hard to find. But where was I? But yeah, so what you do is for an advanced athlete, they may have some exercises, some key exercises, and they may increase volume week to week. So and that volume could be by adding sets to the exercises they had in week 1, or it could simply be from adding new exercises from week 1 to week 2 and week 2 to week 3. You know, you don't want like a billion exercises, but it's good to have exercise variety in regards to hypertrophy or gaining muscle. So an advanced athlete would do that for week to week for maybe of a period of like 5 to 8 weeks. You know, 6 weeks might be good, 5 weeks, 8 weeks, and then after they added volume from those weeks, week to week, it could be like 1 set per muscle group a week. And then you have to be careful of crossover of muscle groups. But again, essentially it's a set per muscle group per week. So from week 1 to week 6, they gradually increase volume. And if you looked at week 1 volume and week 6 volume, there's a huge difference in volume. That's a pretty big difference. But the entire time, if you're eating properly, you're gaining muscle the entire time. You're not increasing load, which means you're not increasing fatigue dramatically either, you know? And during this block 2, especially since your goal is not like, you know, strength training at that point, you're just trying to add volume to to increase muscle mass, you don't have to train to failure. Just train within 2 to 4 reps within failure should be fine. 2 to 5 reps, somewhere around that rep range. So once you do that throughout the volume block, you take a deload and you can start like an intensity block. An intensity block would be your focus is no longer on accumulating volume. Your focus is on now getting stronger, And to get stronger, it's back to what I said earlier, specificity is king. You can, from like a period of like 4 weeks, let's just say we'll take 4 weeks, or you could do 6 weeks, but a period of 4 weeks, you decrease volume from weeks 1 to 4. So each week you can decrease volume, but you lower the rep ranges, which is increasing the weight that you're using. And you also can increase intensity of effort, which is, a raise RPE. So you get a little bit closer to failure during these weeks between weeks 1 and 4. The rep range is lower and the weights get heavier. So you're kind of using all this newfound muscle, these bigger muscle fibers, because remember, you're kind of almost virtually tapped out on skill acquisition and nervous system adaptation at this point. Remember, you can still make improvements on those. I'm not saying you can't. You can always work on your technique. As humans, we're not perfect, but it's heavy diminishing returns at that point. So during this intensity block, you use that newfound muscle you did from weeks 1 through 6 during that volume block to lift heavier weights. That's what you do. So weeks 1 through 4, again, you lower the rep range, increase RPE, and then decrease volume. Because again, you don't want what you don't want, which I see some people doing, and again, it's hard. I don't know why they do this. Maybe it could be me needing to learn something else, but again, I don't think that is the case. I mean, I always have something to learn, but I mean, in this instance, I just think that this would be the incorrect way to set a program up. Is I see people raise the RPE so they get closer to failure. They increase volume and they make the weights heavier. To me, that's just a recipe for overtraining and increasing your injury risk. And I don't know if that's the most efficient way to increase strength. Again, studies have shown that like high amounts of delayed onset muscle soreness has been shown to hinder strength gains in subsequent days. So if you're doing all 3 of those things, training to failure or very close to failure, like 1 rep shy of failure, you're going with heavier weights and you're increasing volume, that's not the best way to improve strength. So one of those has to give, and during an intensity block is volume, because again, your goal is not to gain muscle during that block, it's to get stronger. So so basically what that means is you're just, now when you think about it, or at the end, let's go back, at the end of that intensity block, you could take another deload and then you can test to see where your new 1 rep maxes are at. Yep, that's basically what an advanced athlete is. And then based on those new 1 rep maxes, since you're an advanced athlete, you can calculate those 1 rep maxes and plug those new 1 rep maxes. Hopefully, if everything goes correct, you set new PRs, plug those 1 rep maxes into the beginning of your program and figure out what new weights you're using for those rep ranges. Because again, you can pick weights for rep ranges based on percentages of your 1 rep max. Those will probably go up a little bit, and you can rinse and repeat from the beginning, and those new slightly higher weights will give you more total volume during your volume block. So now you went from at the beginning increasing a weight for the same rep ranges, increasing weight for every week as a beginner, to an intermediate, increasing weight for the same rep ranges every 5 weeks, to now you're basically doing it every 12 to 16 weeks. And then to keep this next part real simple, a super advanced athlete could even have 2 volume blocks. 1 volume block with slightly higher rep ranges, deload, then the next volume block kind of getting to more heavier weights but still focused on gaining muscle, and then the third block would be an intensity block. So then you even have like maybe 6 months before you test for a PR, or maybe even a year, up to a year. So again, it's just just depends on where you're at in your training cycle. So hopefully this helped you guys, and I hope you understand what I was trying to go with this. Is a lot of people don't focus on progression. It is probably one of the most overlooked aspects of a training program. What happens is people don't focus on progression, and they just go into the gym, they start picking reps, weights, and exercises, but they don't know how that ties into the next week. They just pick random times when they're going to go heavier, and when they're going to train higher reps, and when they're going to train to failure. And if you do it random like that, you're going to have random results. If you have things structured and structured progression, then you're going to do better, because you're going to start seeing, okay, well, I'm going to test this time and this leads into this, and then I know exactly when I'm trying to PR. And again, sometimes you don't PR because other things go wrong. You didn't have a good day. You didn't eat properly. Nerves got to you. But regardless, you're not going to know it's because you didn't have structure in your program. But if you guys have any questions, comments, please post them down below. Again, check out my website, jpfitnesspro.com, for online training programs, or to sign up for my newsletter. But until then, I'll see you guys next time.